Chapter 11, Friends Don't Forget Each Other. In the mirror, Dido was much younger than Aelita knew her to be during the video conference. The same thing could be said of Professor Hertz, or rather, Major Steinbach. "Tell me where the supercomputer that you have constructed is located," said Dido, seated at a small bar table, "and let me destroy it. I will erase your mind of certain confidential information, only the most dangerous details, and then leave you to live in peace. You too as well as Aelita. I'm offering you salvation." Hertz responded that this was out of the question and Dido resumed her speech. "Be smart about this. You know to what extent I can be dangerous." At that moment, the control box hit Aelita right in the head and rolled across the floor, stopping not far from her. The girl picked it up. According to the computer, Jeremy's voice immediately sounded, "You've just made contact with the mirror's navigation interface. It's telling me that it's an interaction system that allows you to practically touch and use objects along your way. But most importantly, using it, you can move from one place to another in your father's journal, or rather, from one moment to another." Aelita paused to think. She had materialized on a road that led to the old factory, just as Yumi and Aud had. And she now looked how she usually did on Lyoko, like a pointy-eared elf dressed in a short, pink shirt and soft leather boots of the same color. The girl had run into Professor Hertz while walking down the road and had followed her to the cafe, where she had then heard her conversation with Dido. And now, the control box. Gripping it hard in her right fist, Aelita left the cafe and breathed in the fresh morning air. This virtual world was so perfect. She could sense the smells and the light touch of the wind against her skin. She hadn't even felt the slightest bit of vertigo that always resulted from virtualization. "Yumi and Aud are at the end of the mirror, correct?" she asked Jeremy. "Yes," he immediately replied. "So if I continuously press the forward button on this control, sooner or later, I'll get to them." She didn't wait to hear her friend's response. There was no doubt that her idea was right. She pressed the button on the box and the sky rained down on her head. Thousands of drops of light blue fell on her like hot wax. Buildings began to darken. Windows on an apartment block stretched downwards, drawing a series of obscure lines on the concrete facade. Streetlights bowed, bending towards the ground before turning into puddles that spread across the bitumen. It took but a few seconds for this calm city to change into a very different place, a place that Aelita knew all too well, the third underground floor of the factory. "I did it," she exclaimed enthusiastically. "I'm in the factory. I've found them." "Sorry, but no," Jeremy fumbled. "Look at the screen on the box." Aelita did as he said. The screen read June 1st, 1994 and the time. It was 4:30 in the afternoon. "The mirror encompasses several different days," Jeremy observed. "Although you're in the factory, Yumi and Aud aren't with you, because you're in a different moment. I can't tell you when it is exactly, but I suppose that the mirror ends at a moment on the 6th of June, the day when you went to Lyoko with your father." Aelita nodded silently. She suddenly noticed a familiar shadow obscured by the large cylinder of the supercomputer, but she briskly turned away so as not to see it. If her father was there, she didn't want to see him, she didn't feel ready. Deep down, it was nothing but a recording. And her top priority was to find her friends. She pressed the button on the box a second time, and again, and again. The waxy rain transformed into a tempest of colors that coated her elf clothes. The world surrounding Aelita was changing at a vertiginous rate. The factory, the attic and the hermitage living room, images of her father, appearing for a moment before evaporating in the blink of an eye like a ghost. Aelita closed her eyes while continuing to hammer the button with her thumb. "Stop," Jeremy said. "You're there. It's the end of the mirror." Aelita once again found herself on the third underground floor of the factory, but this time, nobody was there. The resulting silence was almost surreal. Yumi and Aud were on the second floor, the scanner room, and to get to them, Aelita had to use the lift. She readied herself to confront XANA. The park in the first city was surrounded by a tall, metallic grid which currently had no opening, but XANA simply had to wave a hand in front of him to twist the bars to the sides, creating a hole large enough for him to pass through effortlessly. The young man entered without even looking around. Ulrich counted to 10 in his head and followed him inside. He found himself in a dense grove composed of blue trees with thin trunks, twisted branches, and thorns all over. They were a luminous, almost resplendent color, unnatural in every way. Ulrich brushed one of them with his hand and immediately drew back, suppressing a whimper. A deep cut had opened in his hand, already beginning to bleed. These trees were sharp. This world is one of the most dangerous ones, he thought to himself. He had already realized this when he had come here with Yumi using the equipment in Brussels, but at that time he had used the outmoded gloves and helmets to connect to the virtual reality, rather than actually going there. He had to stay alert now. He prudently moved forward, head low and following the dull sound of XANA's footsteps in front of him, until he heard a voice. Children, at last. I've been waiting so long for children to come here. Ulrich held his breath. XANA had just found the ghost of Furman's Hopper. The boy closed the gap between XANA and himself as fast as he could and hid behind a shrub of pointed crystals that seemed to be made of pieces of broken bottles all fused together. The professor walked on air, his feet a few centimeters above the ground. He then stopped. His usual lab coat was open and he was wearing glasses and had a long beard, but Ulrich could see through his body, as if he were nothing but a cloud of colored vapor. Is that really you, Professor? XANA asked him, standing in front of the man. I've waited here for years. Since I discovered that the first city could be turned into a weapon. Hopper had not responded to him. He was nothing but a recording, exactly like the ones in the journal in the mirror. Ulrich saw XANA clench his fists. He acted swiftly, throwing 2 punches at the man, but the boy's hands went straight through him without doing him any harm. Hopper's image trembled, and he continued to speak. Obviously, I'm not here with you. Unfortunately. But maybe I can help you. And you can also help me. Follow me. The ghost began to retreat between the trees, but XANA didn't move an inch. Instead, he began to speak. Loudly. Ulrich, come out of there, he said. It makes me nervous to have you prowling around behind me like a little dog. Oh no, he'd been spotted. Ulrich rose from behind the bush and lightly flexed his knees, ready to escape into the trees if need be. XANA might actually be quicker than him, but it was worth a shot. You left Eva back there, the young man asked him. Yes. I promise that she will be fine for now. Let's get going, I don't want to lose sight of Hopper. You can keep me company. XANA simply began to walk in the direction the ghost had gone. After a second of stupor, Ulrich decided to follow him. Keep him company? This XANA was far different to the emotionless monster he and the rest of the group had fought on Lyoko. Maybe his rebirth had changed him, made him more human. But Ulrich hadn't the least intention of letting his guard down. The metallic doors of the elevator slid aside, but Aelita remained rooted to the spot. The scanner columns were in front of her. She saw Yumi and Ott. And that other boy with long, black hair. She finally recognized him. Aelita, Jeremy's voice spurted into her ear, communicating from reality. Our friends are fighting XANA, but don't worry, now I've managed to re-establish contact, I can get you out of there in no time. Wait, she responded. Now that she could see XANA in person, she was sure that he seemed very familiar to her. The shape of his eyes, his nose, his shoulders, he brought to mind an old friend. Was she going crazy? Yumi and Ott stood, smiling timidly. You didn't have to come, Yumi told her. This is all my fault, Ott commented, looking at her sadly. Eva Skinner is XANA and I didn't even realize. All of a sudden, Aelita's ears were filled with voices. In reality, Jeremy, Professor Hertz, and the others' parents had began to argue. Eva is XANA. But Ulrich is with her in the first city. We have to help him. Aelita remained immobile. It was so strange, XANA was there, in the mirror, but at the same time, he was inside Eva Skinner, in the other virtual world. The young man with dark hair bowed in greeting. Don't worry. Ulrich and Eva are fine, although they cannot leave the first city. I blocked the connection to the Hermitage scanner. I wanted to see you. Why? Aelita asked. XANA's eyes were riveted on her. He completely ignored Yumi and Ott, who were retreating little by little towards their friend. This monster in the body of a boy was concentrating on Aelita. And he smiled. You must remember me. I don't want to talk about when I controlled Lyoko, but how I was in the beginning, when I adopted the form of a small boy and you and I spent all our afternoons together. Together, she echoed, unsteady. There was something in the beginning? Aelita remembered XANA's monsters attacking her. She remembered the towers she had to enter to stop the mad artificial intelligence from destroying the world. And she remembered her father, who had given his life to destroy XANA. He had killed him. She was talking to her father's assassin. She could not forget that for a single second. Yes, the young man exclaimed. You came to see me every day in the first city. We always played together. You were my first, my only, friend. Up until the day when your father decided that I was dangerous, that I could lose control, and he forced you to never come see me again. I don't remember any of that, Aelita admitted, confused. Guys, Jeremy's voice sounded in her ear again. This monster is right, I can't get in contact with the first city. But I am connected to you, so I'm going to materialize you back into reality right away. It's too dangerous to stay there. Got it, boss, Odd whispered. Aelita, on the other hand, made a negative gesture with her head. You go. I want to stay here. Have you gone crazy? Yumi asked, full of concern and gripping her arm. This guy is XANA. He could hurt you. He could even, if he's right, Aelita interrupted, if at one time, we were friends, then I want to stay here and get a better understanding of everything. Friends don't forget each other. If I did, I need to know why. With these words, XANA smiled again. Aelita should have hated him. He murdered her father. It was his fault that she was all alone. But this boy had a shy look, as if he were a little scared. Aelita felt that she needed to let her instincts guide her. XANA stretched out one arm with a closed fist and then raised his index finger. The finger began to lengthen and seemed to become thinner as well. The nail grew darker and the finger continued to grow larger and thinner, while becoming an intense green color. And then, the upper part became a rosebud, opening into a red rose. Murmured Yumi from behind her. Flowers. Never trust a man who gives you flowers, he's surely done something wrong. Aelita didn't really pay attention to her friend. You can leave, she repeated. Jeremy, materialize them into reality. She raised her voice to add her final word, I'm staying here. Are you sure? Aelita nodded silently, eyes glued to the strange boy whose finger had just blossomed. If that's what you want. When she turned around, Odd and Yumi had disappeared. She was alone in the mirror. Alone with XANA. The parents of the two teens who had just come out of the mirror threw themselves onto their children, embracing and kissing them. I'm fine, Daddy, I'm fine. Yumi said, trying to pry herself away from him. Mom, please be careful, you're going to mess up my hair. Odd implored. But they laughed. They weren't expecting to see their parents there, in the hermitage. And they didn't understand how they could know all about Lyoko, Professor Hopper, and their adventures. Jeremy sighed and shifted his gaze away from them to concentrate on the computer once more. He had lost contact with Ulrich, and now with Aelita too. The scanner was only transmitting electrostatic discharges now, and he wasn't receiving any audio or video signal. XANA had left him completely isolated. He felt paradoxically trapped in the real world. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned, meeting Richard's bright eyes and shy smile. You're worried about her, aren't you? Jeremy nodded. So am I. But we need to trust Aelita. She's always been very empathetic. You know what I mean. She manages to put herself in other people's shoes, to understand them and be by their side. XANA is not a person, Jeremy grumbled. It's a computer program. That may be so, Richard consented. Or maybe there's something we still don't know, and that she managed to sense somehow. She made her decision, and we need to respect that for now. You'll see, everything will be fine in the end. Jeremy felt all his fatigue weigh down on him in one go. It had been a very long day, what with their parents' arrival at Kadak, bringing their memories back, repairing the scanner. And now this. Their archenemy, XANA, was back. There were even two of him. It was really too much for just one day, and he felt his hands tremble against the keyboard. And what do we do now? We need to go back to the school, Professor Hertz responded. I'll talk to the principal about preparing some rooms for our guests. Oh, but there's no need. Akiko Ishiyama immediately intervened. Our house is right nearby, and we have more than enough room for everyone. All right then, the professor nodded. But Jeremy and Odd need to come back to school with me. Principal Delmas is nervous enough after they skipped classes yesterday and today. And now, the icing on the cake, I have to explain Eva, Ulrich, and Aelita's disappearances to him. Odd nervously tapped his hands together a few times, enthused. He had been thinking of sleeping with his mother and father, like he had when he was younger. And Jeremy rejoiced at the idea of returning to the school and burying himself under the sheets, in his own room. He was dying of sleep deprivation. He didn't yet know that this night, he would get barely any sleep at all. Chapter 12, Memory's True Identity. Professor Hopper was floating in the air several steps away from them. "We're here." The road that Ulrich and XANA were on was the color of rubies and crossed the sky of the first city like a large, wind-blown scarf, without the need of columns or any support to hold it up. At a certain point, the road veered jarringly to the left, and it was only upon reaching the end of the turn that Ulrich noticed the presence of the castle that a moment earlier had been hidden by the blue skyscrapers that were sprung up all around like crystal fingers. The castle stood at the very center of the first city. It was a black building in the form of a hexagon, its upper levels finished off with ore and stone gargoyles. It had neither doors nor windows of any sort, as if the fortress had been carved out of a single block of stone. Ulrich clenched his teeth and jumped down from the road in the air. It was a 10-meter drop, but the young man landed on all fours without the slightest of harm. This was one of the advantages of the virtual world. "Wow," he exclaimed. A short distance away, there was another golden ribbon road that rose above the ground and led to the castle, encircling it twice only to disappear somewhere over the horizon. XANA arrived beside Ulrich without even needing to jump, levitating gracefully over to the boy. He gestured to him, and they started to travel down the golden path together, approaching the imposing castle. Ulrich didn't think he had ever seen such an intense black before. It absorbed all the light around it, storing it in its opaque interior. Hopper materialized in front of them and pointed to a concrete point somewhere underneath them. "Look," he said. Corresponding to each peak of the hexagon, 6 rows of black bricks covered the ground of the city, forming 6 straight lines that became lost through the towers and streets, dividing them apart like architectural scissors. From above, the castle must seem like the black center of a giant star. "You must pay close attention, children," Hopper continued. "This castle is a weapon. I built it with the men in black, and neither ANTHEA nor I were able to do anything to prevent it." Ulrich realized that the professor wasn't really looking at them. His eyes bored into space. He remembered that this wasn't really Aelita's father, only an extremely sophisticated computer program. "I wanted to deactivate the castle and render it harmless. I hoped that this way, the first city could transform into a gift for humanity instead of an instrument of destruction. Unfortunately, I committed an error. While I was fleeing from the men in black, I needed to reconstruct the city to be able to continue my research. But with it, I also needed to reconstruct the castle. This is when I understood that deactivating it wouldn't be possible." Hopper stopped and gave a sigh before continuing. "That is why I have decided to isolate it in a sandbox, forever enclosing the city in a place where it can cause no damage, and I built Lyoko. Lyoko was built as a barrier world capable of blocking the harmful effects of the castle while leaving intact its beneficial powers. But in order for my plan to be realized, I needed an ally, someone capable of controlling Lyoko and the first city. I needed a guardian." "A guardian?" whispered Ulrich. "Yes," said the young black-haired man opposite him with a smile. "Me." "The guardian," Hopper continued, "must be a very sophisticated artificial intelligence. I named him XANA, and to teach him to be human, I let he and my daughter, Aelita, become friends." Odd yawned and rolled over. He tried to put his head under his pillow and count sheep, but nothing could be done about it, so he gave up and switched on the lamp on his nightstand. He looked at the alarm clock. It was barely 3 in the morning. The young man couldn't stay calm. Too many thoughts kept rolling about in his mind like a caged tornado. After their return to the real world, the others got them up to date on the situation, and it was a real mess. All of their parents had been collaborators with Hopper. And Walter's turn. He was nothing but a traitor. Poor Ulrich. That must be difficult for his friend to take in. Another thing that kept him from sleeping was the memory of his father that he had found in the memory card, the video of Aelita's mother, kidnapped and gagged. Before heading to bed, Odd had talked with Jeremy a bit about it, but his friend was so exhausted that he might not have even heard him. And, what's more, he had another thought. one that covered all the rest like a black veil, Eva Skinner. For the first time in his life, Odd felt ready to have a girlfriend and to dedicate himself solely to her. And then, what did he discover? That Eva wasn't a real person, but XANA, his enemy. Odd had fallen in love with a computer program. And an evil program to make things worse. "That's IT," he cried, and this time, he pulled out his sheets with a kick and stood up. With Ulrich shut in the first city, his room felt empty and sad, and Odd needed to speak with someone, with a real friend. He reached for his phone and turned it on. Then, he waited several seconds for the old device to get going and tried to call Jeremy. His phone was off. "Well, you won't escape me," he commented enthusiastically. "You're going to keep me company, even if I have to kick down your door." Odd let out a small laugh and put on a large jacket over his pajamas. It had already been several long minutes since he knocked on Jeremy's door, but his friend hadn't come to open it. He must be in a deep sleep. For a moment, Odd thought he'd leave him be. After all, it was late and Jeremy might need some sleep. Then, his attention was caught by the doorknob. There was something strange about the lock. It was scratched, and the metal was bent towards the outside. Has someone broken in? The idea hadn't yet fully formed in his head, and so Odd was already turning the knob. He heard the lock protest with a quiet creak. He clenched his teeth and pushed the door with his shoulder. The lock suddenly gave way, causing the young man to fall flat on his face once in the room. Jeremy's room was pitch black. The light from the hall filtered inside, forming a bright triangle that spread across the floor all the way to his friend's empty and unmade bed. The sheets and covers were rolled up in a ball as if they had been shoved away with a kick. Where could Jeremy have gone at this time of night? And why were there those marks on the lock? He found the light switch on the wall and turned on the light, closing the door behind him. This was good old Jeremy's room, all right. Perfectly in order, except for his desk, which was completely covered in computers and other machines. Hanging on the wall just above the bed was his poster of Einstein sticking his tongue out at the camera. And on the other side of the room was his closet. Odd approached the desk, but he didn't see anything strange. He turned around, then realized that there was a note tacked to the back of the door. The young man snatched it up immediately. The tack popped out and fell to the ground with a ting as Odd's eyes opened wide. It was a simple business card with a drawing of a strange bird and the words Green Phoenix printed on it in very historical typography. On the reverse side, someone had written in a very legible manner, "Your friend is now with us." The Green Phoenix had kidnapped Jeremy. Jeremy was immobilized. The man with the sharp face had broke into his room without making the slightest bit of noise and taken him without giving him time to react. A true professional. Jeremy then realized who he was facing. It was, without a shadow of a doubt, Grigory Nictopoulos, the man with the dogs who had used the memory-snatching machine on Robert Della Robbia and the Ishiyamas. The young man had been taken out in 2 seconds. He smelled a strange odor climb into his nose and he lost consciousness. Upon awakening, he found himself paralyzed. His arms were tied behind his back and his legs bent behind him with his heels digging into his back. He couldn't see anything either. Someone had taken away his glasses and his head was in a black canvas bag that restricted his breathing. His head hurt, his mouth was sealed by something that tasted like plastic, adhesive tape, he thought, and his ankles and wrists had been bound up tightly in such a way as to cause him a lot of pain each time he tried to move. Jeremy tried to remain calm. How much time had gone by since he was taken? Think, he said to himself. When Grigory arrived, he had just gone to sleep and he hadn't felt the need to drink or go to the bathroom, so it could only have been several hours maximum that he was unconscious. It was probably 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Odd and the others wouldn't notice his absence until the following morning. He couldn't hope for an immediate rescue. Furthermore, how could they rescue him? Grigory was armed and dangerous, and his friends. "The kid's awake," came a catty, masculine voice. Jeremy felt a pair of hands grab him and he tried to get away from them and cry out, but he wasn't able to. Someone slightly lifted the sack from his head, and a hand entered holding a tissue soaked with a substance that flooded his nostrils. Jeremy swallowed his spit. He shouldn't breathe it in. His struggle only lasted a few moments. Then, he felt his head become heavier and heavier before he passed out again. Principal Delmas is uncombed, gray beard and his puffy eyes fit those of someone who had too little sleep. Professor Hertz also seemed exhausted. Odd shivered under his jacket. He was still wearing his pajamas underneath and his bare feet were frozen. "What are you going to do?" he asked the adults. Immediately after having discovered the note, the young man went to fill in the professor, and then, they went together to call the principal. They still hadn't informed Jeremy's father and the others. It was more important to trace out a good plan first. "We have to call the police," Delmas spoke decisively. "Or better, Dido," Odd quickly contradicted him. Jeremy had told him everything that happened during the time he was in the mirror as well as their alliance with the boss of the Men in Black. "Dido," said the principal, raising an eyebrow. "And just who is this Dido?" Spoke the professor while throwing a deadly look Odd's way. But the young man didn't let that intimidate him. Jeremy had been kidnapped. This wasn't a good time to worry about formalities. "Dido is a secret agent," he explained. "She manages a government agency." He tried to summarize the situation as best he could, remembering what Jeremy had told him. Hertz sighed with resignation and helped him to explain everything to the principal. At the end of the story, there was a long moment of silence. Delmas wrung his hands together nervously, then gave an audible sigh. "Professor, is this all true?" "Yes," Hertz replied to him, holding his gaze. "Some of my students are involved in an international plot, and there is a supercomputer that is also a deadly weapon, and you are allied with a secret agency to fight against an army of terrorists." "Correct," nodded Odd with enthusiasm. "And you haven't told me anything until they've now kidnapped one of the students." Odd started to get the feeling that the principal wasn't totally happy with the situation, and he bit his lip. "You shouldn't worry about it, Mr. Delmas," he said, trying to smile. "Jeremy is a smart kid, and he can take care of himself. And the same goes for Aelita and Ulrich and Eva. I know this all seems rather, well, desperate, but you'll see, we'll get through it." "Maybe," murmured Delmas, acceptingly. "At this point, it seems useless to me to call the police. Professor Hertz, call this Dido and ask her what we can do. In the meantime, I'll get in contact with the children's parents and tell them to come here immediately." Odd tried to think what Jeremy would say in his place. What ideas would he have? "That won't be enough, Mr. Delmas," he said, standing up. "You also need to think about the other students. Kadak is now in danger. You have to wake them all up and have them prepare to defend the school." The principal and the professor looked at him, stupefied. Jeremy opened his eyelids. He was still tied up at the feet and hands, but he was no longer laid out on his stomach on the ground, but sat up on a wooden chair with armrests in a rotating seat. Someone had removed the adhesive tape over his mouth and his head was no longer covered, although it didn't make a big difference considering that he was still without his glasses. The young man found himself in a very small room that smelled of dust and was largely occupied by a wide desk. It was so close to him that the edge of the table pushed into his knees, and a large metal filing cabinet that sat to his right. In front of him was a door, and to the left, a window through which an icy breeze and fine blue light entered. It was surely almost daybreak. Even without being able to distinguish the details of the place, Jeremy quickly understood where he was, in the director's office in the old factory that was situated in the middle of the river. The same factory that housed Lyoko's supercomputer and which, for the time being, was being occupied by the soldiers of the Green Phoenix. He smiled. In a sense, Aelita and Ulrich were there, close to him, virtualist in the sandboxes of the supercomputer. He hoped that they would be okay and that they were doing well to keep out of XANA's clutches. "I need to get out of here," thought Jeremy. "And as quick as possible." He tried to move. Someone had placed his arms behind his back, and they were attached to his ankles with plastic cords or something of the sort. His feet were pressed against the pivoting base of the chair, but each movement that he made with them echoed to his wrists, causing him to painfully jolt. He clenched his teeth and tried to turn around using his back. The chair moved slightly. He continued in the opposite direction with more force and found his elbow pressed against the desk. Now, he could bend his arm, and he could maybe manage to tilt the chair and cause it to fall to the ground. From there, with a bit of luck, the office door opened, and Jeremy stopped moving, slowly turning his head towards the person who came in and moved their hand about the wall looking for the light switch. After hearing the click, He had to shut his eyes as they had adjusted to the darkness. This unknown person closed the door behind her and approached him. "They didn't give you back your glasses yet, did they? Here." It was a woman, and she had a friendly voice. Jeremy felt delicate fingers place the frame of his glasses correctly on his nose. The woman then sat on the desk, several centimeters from him, with her legs crossed. She must be at least 50 years old. She was red-headed and her face was clean, without any type of makeup. She was wearing jeans and a shirt, and a lab coat over top with a screwdriver sticking out of the pocket. "I'm Memory. What's your name?" "Jeremy," he replied, even though this wasn't much of a question. If they had kidnapped him, they had to know without a doubt who he was. "Don't be scared, Jeremy. Everything will be okay. We need you. But I'm sure that you'll help us, and afterwards, you can go back to the school." "I don't have the slightest intention of helping a bunch of terrorists," Jeremy spat out, looking at her fixedly. "Please," Memory's voice seemed upset, "think before you act and don't be careless. My boss, Hannibal Mago, well, let's just say that sometimes he can be somewhat impulsive." Hannibal Mago, the head of Green Phoenix. Suddenly, Jeremy felt dizzy. "I came here," the woman continued, "to bring you to him and warn you that you need to be careful. I wouldn't want something to happen to you." She seemed sincere, but Jeremy's heart continued to race. Hannibal Mago, and he was on the verge of meeting him. Memory stood up and took out a utility knife from her coat. While she moved around, the neck of her shirt opened slightly and Jeremy's eyes caught sight of something around the woman's neck. Memory was wearing a delicate, golden chain, but it was the end of the necklace that caught the young boy's attention. It was round and as large as an old coin, and 2 letters were engraved on it, a W and an A, surrounded by a sailor's knot. Jeremy knew this necklace well, because Aelita had one exactly like it. Her father had left it for her before he disappeared. And Aelita's hair was a magnificent fire red color. Just like Anthea's, her mother. Just like Memory's.
So, at the end of this episode, we learned that Anthea may still be alive, just like in evolution. So, XANA and Aelita are having to get together, while XANA and Ulrich are in the first city, gathering intel on the past, and how XANA was to be created for. And now that Ray Tabulus had captured Jeremy, with Memory in tow to gather information on how to work the supercomputer, what will our gang of Lyoko warriors do now? So, here's the thing. I know it's been a while since the last episode, and I was being a bit lazy, and a bit busy gathering what I need to do to get ready for the next week. You know, socializing with friends, being on Discord and all that. And for that comment, how I need to get a better microphone for voice recording, I might as well see if I can get a better microphone for my birthday on the 21st of January. In the meanwhile, I've been doing my best voice recording with what I have, which is a desktop microphone, a crappy one at that. Maybe I might get a webcam or some animatic upgrade. Who knows? Perhaps I can pay for the upgrade myself with enough commissions from my PayPal. That being said, I hope you people enjoy the episode and hope you all tune in to the next one. Drop a like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll talk to you all later.